A fatal missile blast in Poland serves as a potent reminder that the Ukraine conflict could easily escalate to draw in NATO, despite recent developments in Ukraine's favor. Amongst those developments, Russia's decision to withdraw its forces from the key regional city of Kherson. Ukrainian troops reclaimed the city to the joy of exhausted residents and to praise from President Zelensky, who called it the beginning of the end of the war. Yet far from winding down, Russia's been ramping up missile attacks on critical energy infrastructure, leaving millions of Ukrainians without power. Our question this week, after Kherson, what are Russia's strategic goals? Hello, and a very warm welcome to The Point. It is a pleasure to introduce our guests. Makeeva is editor-in-chief of the Russian broadcaster OstWest-Tv, based here in Germany. Konstantin von Hammerstein reports on defense and security issues for the German news magazine Der Spiegel. And joining us remotely from Bonn is my Ukrainian colleague, Goncharenko, who works with DW's Russian desk. Great to have all of you with us. Konstantin, let's start with that missile blast that killed 2 people in Poland. Poland, of course, is a NATO member. The consensus seems to be that the incident was not a deliberate attack by Russia. Do you share that view? And how quickly could this have provoked escalation if experts had not reached that conclusion?
Well, I share. That's what everybody knows is that it was, in fact, an accident, that a Ukrainian or air defense missile just missed the target and went down in Poland and killed 2 people. But, of course, it was a very dangerous situation. I mean, just imagine it would have been a Russian attack or a Russian-provoked accident. Then we had a completely different ballgame. I don't think that this would have provoked a Article 5 response by NATO, but of course it would have escalated the situation very seriously.
Maria, the deadly explosion occurred as Russia has been pounding critical infrastructure, energy, water, utilities across the country, including very close to the Polish border. Is Putin playing with fire?
Basically, he plays with fire from the very beginning. Actually, from 2014, probably even. Yeah, so, and I just answer you, yes, of course. And also, starting a war with NATO country is the last thing he wants now. And I just had some conversation with my Moscow friends about it, which is more and more complicated with every day because many people just left and who stay there, they have some, understanding of what's going on and they're closer to probably some advisors of government guys, so on. They say that's probably even he just dreaming about being in 23 of February now, just to change his mind and not starting all this war.
And whether he might change his mind is something we want to pick up on just a little bit later. But let me go now to Roman. And Roman, the bombardment of Ukraine's cities and power infrastructure that we've seen just recently was the most massive missile attack since the war began. The U.S. ambassador to the UN is accusing Putin essentially of trying to freeze Ukrainians who have no power into submission. That hardly sounds like we're seeing the beginning of the end of the war, which is what President Zelensky said on his visit to Kherson.
Not at all. So we have to brace ourselves for a longer war, definitely months ahead, probably years. So Russia is basically trying to do 2 things. It is trying to go in an offensive in the east of Ukraine, in Donbass, which is not so successful. It is not successful at all in the south. And it has much more success with such strikes, missile strikes we've seen in the past place. And what is new, maybe, is that Russia is trying to hit Ukrainian gas stations and its gas industry, because Ukraine is producing gas as well for its own demand. And this gives us an idea what Russia is aiming at. It is aiming at to, before winter, and winter is very, very cold in Ukraine, to destroy the Ukrainian power structure, the power grid, and the gas energy supplies. It has already taken over a nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. It could try to take control of other power plants, nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and by hitting the critical infrastructure, of course, Russia is trying to, so to say, bomb Ukraine back to the negotiating table.
The explosion in Poland and the barrage of attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure were occurring just as world leaders were meeting in Bali, half a world away. To the surprise of many, they wound up issuing a joint declaration condemning the Russian war on Ukraine.
Planting trees for the environment and freedom. But the peaceful statement by the G20 participants was abruptly drowned out by reports of new Russian missile attacks in Ukraine. The reactions were suitably sharp.
At the moment when world leaders here in Bali are seeking to make progress on global peace, Putin is striking civilian targets and children and women. I mean, it's almost, in my words, not yours, barbaric what he's doing.
At our summit, everyone talked about how to end the Russian war. Even the Russian delegate made comments on the subject. And then nearly 100 Russian missiles hit Ukraine, burning down residential buildings, destroying power plants again. Hundreds of cities were left without electricity, water, heat, and internet. Is Putin's Russia finally isolated from the global community?
And let me put that question straight away to Konstantin. Konstantin, this G20 statement at the end of the meeting, that apparently, according to the Indonesian host, was reached unanimously, meaning it would have had some kind of buy-in from Russian allies, China and India. Do you think it makes a difference?
Of course it makes a difference, because Russia is completely isolated. The Ukrainian President Zelensky was talking not about G20 but about G19. And if you saw the pictures, just Lavrov was sitting there in a T-shirt somewhere under palm trees. It showed, I think, exactly where Russia stands in the diplomatic world. It's isolated. Of course, not everybody is really has a stake in this conflict in Europe. African, Latin American states don't have the same stake as the Europeans or Americans have. But I think the declaration really shows that Russia is isolated, and so it's a big blow for the Russian diplomatic efforts.
Maria, Konstantin mentioned Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, sitting under the palm trees. But in fact, he was sitting in the room at the G20 meeting when President Zelensky gave his virtual speech to the group. And Lavrov then fired back with a long set of accusations, essentially once again declaring Russia to be the true victim in this conflict. Would you expect the G20 statement and this buy-in from China and India, to whatever extent it's there, to actually make a difference for Vladimir Putin in his calculations?
Actually, Vladimir Putin didn't come to G20 not just because he has something more important to do. It's because he expected such reaction, of course. And this is basically nothing so new, because all last months, which war continues, world shows him that he's not right, what he's doing, and he's going to be completely isolated, as you, Konstantin, told before. But also, I'm not agree with in the question about India, because I just heard last week, I think, that was some government minister who declared that what is good and lead to prosperity of our people, we are going to do. He was talking about gas prices. And this is very generous for Indians now, I mean, Russian gas. So, and they are going to continue. So, completely isolated in one sense. Everybody disagree with the war itself, but it's not about trade, not probably for India and China. So,
So
it's morally isolated.
So you
but
don't
not
see
economically.
China and India
Not
putting real
economically, yeah.
pressure on Vladimir Putin?
China probably, I expect that, because there is moments when it could be some new page of relations of China and West, and if it will be so China will choose what's good for that country. In that sense, probably something will be different.
And Roman, in fact, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was one of the very few people to actually meet face-to-face with Sergei Lavrov. Chinese media report that Lavrov said that a nuclear war cannot be won, I'm quoting here, and must never be fought. So coming back to the question of potential escalation of this conflict, what, if anything, does that tell us about Russia's intentions?
Well, it is important, of course, that the world leaders of the G20 summit said that there should be no nuclear threats, no nuclear war in Ukraine as well. So, and the danger was there because there was Russian rhetoric threatening Ukraine with nuclear weapons, especially very harsh rhetoric by the former President Dmitry Medvedev and maybe some others. I would say that after the summit, maybe this danger is not over, but it has diminished. Important is that in that declaration there was a condemnation of the war. There was the war itself. The word war was in that declaration. In Russia, it is still called special military operation. And if you remember, in the year 2014, in the summit, during the summit in Australia, there was only mention of geopolitical tensions. So no mentioning of Ukraine, no mention of any kind of war, and that was already after the annexation of Crimea and after the war in Donbass in the eastern Ukraine actually started. So coming back to the question, if Russia is isolated, it is not as isolated as some might hope for in the West. Countries like China and India and also Turkey are very ambivalent, and this remains so. So we're basically where we were in March when the General Assembly adopted that resolution condemning this war, about 140 countries.
Konstantin, Roman says he thinks that the threat of potential nuclear escalation might be slightly less, in part due to the declaration. I'd like to know your take on that, and also strategically speaking, with this war looking less winnable for Russia, and we'll talk in a minute about why that might be the case, but with it looking less winnable, do you think Putin would be more likely to turn to some kind of nuclear weapon?
I don't think so. I think diplomatically, the threat has diminished, but I think militarily it doesn't make any sense to use nuclear weapons. And there's even the question whether Russian troops would be able to use them, because it's a very complicated military maneuver to do this. They are not trained for this. Probably it would kill more Russian soldiers than Ukrainians, and I think it's a lot of talk. It's threats, of course, but even, you probably know better how Russian talk shows work, but even in the Russian talk shows, as far as I know, is the rhetoric was toned down in the last couple of days and weeks.
I see Maria nodding over there.
Yeah, but look, I'm not Putin, yeah? I'm just born Russian, so I don't know what is in his head. As I understand it, that nukes are the very last threat. You couldn't use anything after that. So this is our greatest hope.
So let's talk about what other threats might be on the table. The war looks less winnable for Putin, not least due to his forces' withdrawal from Kherson, which was the first and only regional capital in Ukraine that Russia was able to capture and hold. Strategically, it's a turning point, but in which direction?
Residents of Kherson, both young and old, are still celebrating the city's liberation. After 8 months of Russian occupation, people wave the Ukrainian flag and embrace their soldiers. We have no electricity, no water, no internet, no communications, no heating, but there are no Russians either, and that's why we're happy. What do we feel? Ukraine was, is, and will be. No one will be able to conquer it, crush it. We are united as never before. The Ukrainian president has also visited the liberated city. His surprise visit is a show of strength to Russia.
Is it the beginning of the end of the war? Of course, you see our strong army. We are step by step coming to our country, to all the temporary occupied territories.
But the war is not over yet. Despite reports from Ukrainian sources that their army has recently recaptured around 180 villages in the south, heavy fighting continues in the east. Was Kherson just a flash in the pan in the end?
Maria, how do you interpret Putin's decision to approve an orderly withdrawal from Kherson as opposed to simply seeking to try to hold it despite ongoing losses? Do you think it represents a real shift in Putin's strategy?
I think it's a huge change in the war, but we will see the circumstances not very fast. And I see that will be probably some months or even a year until the war somehow will end, unfortunately. But still there is a huge slap to him, to Putin, because he declared Kherson to be Russian territory. One business is just go forth and back with the troops in other country territory, and another thing to go back from your own, as he thinks about the territory. So his strategy didn't work out, and all mobilization and all these poor guys who were sent to the front, they couldn't do anything for him. They don't want to fight, basically. And Ukrainians defending absolutely heroically. And yeah, this is just results.
Roman, the jubilant Ukrainian forces that we saw in that report clearly have no inclination to take a break after this success. They've been continuing to strike deep behind Russian lines, in particular along the eastern bank of the Dnipro River. Where do you think that things go from here? What do you see as being in store?
Well, I think we should watch Donbass, the east of Ukraine, very closely, because this is where the most severe fighting is taking place, and this is where it is important for Putin to have a kind of a winning situation. So he wants to occupy the whole region of Donetsk. He failed in that. So, and this is where we have reports that the troops from Kherson, Russian troops, are being moved to. They are being moved to the city of Bakhmut, which is a small town actually, but it is on a strategic crossroad between north and south of the Donetsk region, and this is where I expect the Russians will intensify the fighting. And we have to understand that that those missile strikes we've seen in the last days that Russia is continuing, they are also a kind of a response to the fact that Putin had to give up Kherson, and there was a lot of frustration among his supporters. So this is also an opportunity for him to show, look, I'm hitting Ukraine, so Ukraine is in pain, so don't worry, we will win. This is the message also.
Konstantin, some NATO officers, including the head of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, have suggested that a winter lull in fighting would be a good moment for Ukraine and Russia to sit down at the table and try to negotiate. Kiev says that a stalemate would simply allow Russia to consolidate its gains. Who's right?
The Ukrainians, because they have momentum at the moment. It was the Kherson retreat by the Russians was a very significant military blow to the Russian army, because it was completely different from the Ukrainian victory in Kharkiv. They were very fast. The Russians were surprised. They didn't have their strongest forces there, but in Kherson they had their strongest forces, their elite troops, and they had so it was really a significant loss for the Russians. The momentum is on the Ukrainian side, And what Putin wants, he wants to have a pause because he wants to rebuild his army, and he needs to rebuild his army. And if the Ukrainians pressure on, he will have problems to reconstitute or rebuild his army.
And in fact, Maria, he needs to rebuild because, at least according to the same U.S. general, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the casualties on both sides have been 100,000 each. Very serious casualties also, of course, for the Russian side. How long can Russia sustain those kind of losses, not just in terms of the military picture, but also, of course, politically? Do you see any indication in Russia of a genuine willingness to look for a negotiated settlement?
This is a very interesting question, but it couldn't be a short answer, actually, because propaganda works really brilliantly. I mean, in bad sense, because people receiving coffins with the bodies of their dearest ones, and they do not do anything, and they do not ask questions. Or they are very angry and say, Ukraine, what you've done to my son. We've seen these videos like about one woman who is crying in a bus, and she was shouting these exactly words, not Putin, what you've done to my son, with Ukraine. And people mostly just try to survive these harsh times, and they do not think about the war at all in Russia. I understand this is very hard to believe and to understand and to receive. For me, to receive it, this is really hard. But as I understand it, people just live their life and try not to think about it. Putin decided something, and it doesn't matter for me, is Kherson Russian or is Kherson Ukrainians. I will just strive to get some money and get through these difficult times. That's it. Like people speak about it, yeah.
Roman, let me ask you about resolve in Ukraine. As we mentioned, millions of Ukrainians facing massive power outages, emerging evidence that the Russian occupiers in Kherson applied torture to civilians, and evidence that many Ukrainian children have been separated from their families. Does all of that add up to a likelihood that we will see Ukrainian resolve strengthened or exhausted?
Well, there is no indication of Ukrainian resilience diminishing, so it is remaining on a very high level. And although those hardships, all those missile strikes, just make Ukrainian population even more resilient, saying we are ready to leave. Just as Zelensky put it a few months ago in his speech, he said we are ready, addressing Russians. I think he said we will leave without light, without electricity, without supplies, but without you. And I think this is the spirit of Ukraine at the moment.
Konstantin, the German military economist Markus Keops said that just immediately after the Kherson withdrawal, that in fact Russia has already lost the war, but that he believes fighting will continue as long as next September or October. Will the West keep weapons deliveries coming that long, even as their apartments grow colder and their firms are lacking the energy to keep production going and the economies are sliding into recession?
I don't see any diminishing of the Western resolve. Not in Germany, although the numbers are going up for sort of the anti-military faction. But it's still strong, and it is in many other Western countries. It's also strong, and I think the missile attacks on civil targets now is actually good for the resolve, because it shows it's the terrorist nature of the Russian regime, and that you have to fight them, whatever it costs. And so I think I'm more optimistic that the West will stand together in this question.
I think this is also a propaganda thing to say that the West helps Ukraine. No, the West helps itself, because we are starting with the Poland situation, yeah? This is very, very close. So the West basically defends itself. So I also see it, this is like not strong support, but this is the only way. What else to do?
Support,
Yeah.
Let me come back to our title. It is After Kherson, What Are Russia's Strategic Goals? Roman, in a word?
Strategic goals are the same. They haven't changed, which is to destroy Ukraine as a state, as a nation, and to threaten the West.
Maria?
Agreed, absolutely. And keep at power. The main strategic goal for Putin is keeping his power. That's why he invented all this stuff with the Russian world and invading Ukraine.
Would you also agree, Konstantin? Yeah. Kherson is a turning point, and nonetheless, the strategic goals are identical to at the beginning of the war?
You don't really know what Putin is up to, but basically, I think nothing has changed. Yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Thanks to Roman in Bonn, Maria and Konstantin here in the studio, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. If you're watching our program on YouTube, please send us your comments and thoughts. We're eager to hear them. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.